Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Wishing you all a happy Veterans Day, especially those who are joining us who have served or are currently serving. Today's deep dive aquaculture webinar, we're very excited, is focused on strategies to understand, minimize, and resolve shared use conflicts in aquaculture. Focusing on Rhode Island specifically. We are very lucky to have this webinar be led by Julia Bancroft and Tricia Driscoll of Land and Sea Together and the Center for Mediation and Collaboration, Rhode Island. This is really an introductory webinar showing us how to recognize, minimize, and then hopefully address conflicts effectively and early on with respect to aquaculture in Rhode Island. They will discuss typical conflicts that might arise, as well as effective communication strategies to work through these. They hope that you'll take home and take away some examples and practices to help aquaculture operations and neighbors and communities coexist better and more effectively. So very happy to have them. I will share very briefly that this is recorded. We had a prior webinar last month that will be posted online, and upcoming in December will be our last aquaculture deep dive focusing on seaweed aquaculture in Rhode Island specifically. Some great presenters teed up for that. And we will, again, be posting these webinars on what was the Narragansett Bay-Samp website. We just had a technical difficulty getting the October webinar from Robbie Hudson up there, but it should be coming this week. And also just a reminder that we have a Shellfish RI website that has a lot of great information about not just aquaculture topics, but wild harvest shellfish resources. So please check those out. I will also ask folks to put any questions you might have in the chat. We'll monitor that, and hopefully, depending on how many questions we get, there might be some time for a bit of a role play. So I will let our leads share that with us. And with no further ado, Tricia and Julia, welcome. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Azure, for welcoming us this evening. We're happy to see some people on. We're delighted to be here tonight, and hopefully we'll give you some tips and tricks that will help you to at least minimize sort of the chaos that seems to come with conflict. So we might not solve everyone's problems, but we're hoping that we'll give you some skills and strategies that'll make things a little bit better for you. I'd like to introduce Julia Bancroft from our Land and Sea Together program. So Julia?
Hey everyone, I'm Julia Bancroft with the Land and Sea Together program. So firstly, just wanted to start out for those of you who might not be familiar. The Land and Sea Together program has been around for almost 2 years now. I just joined on in the spring with a super awesome team of people here, and we're focused on reducing stress for farmers, fishermen, aquaculturists, and forestry workers and their families in the state of Rhode Island. So we do that in a few different ways, one of which is by offering free access to an employee assistance program, which is a really great resource and tool that we can share a little bit more later. We have a really great network of people that we've made connections with over the last year and a half, and just trying to stay in the loop with great opportunities in the state. So I think next slide, Tricia. Awesome. Yeah. So our mission here is to build that network of services that I mentioned, and opportunities to help reduce stress for the fisheries, forestry, farming, aquaculture included in that, workers and their families in Rhode Island. We know it really takes a village, and these are really tough industries to be in with really high levels of mental health struggles, substance abuse issues. So trying to be there as a resource to help folks navigate just day-to-day stressors.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julia. So
Yeah.
again, my name is Tricia Driscoll. I'm the director of the Center for Mediation and Collaboration, Rhode Island, and we're the sort of parent organization, I guess, of Land and Sea Together. We're a nonprofit located here in Rhode Island, and what we do is we help people to resolve their disputes. We believe in what we call the lived experience model. So that really speaks to the people who are kind of closest to the conflict are the most experts at trying to get through that conflict. So we do a lot of work in the Rhode Island District Courts. We do a lot of training and development for both youth and adults. We do a lot of private mediations between families and coworkers and businesses. And we also provide agricultural mediation here in the state of Rhode Island, which does include the aquaculture industry. And that's a free service that we're going to talk a little bit about later, but it's another way to sort of help you get through conflict. So just a couple of quick notes about tonight. We are going to send the slide deck out. We'll make it available. As Azure said earlier, this whole presentation tonight will be available as a recording. We also have some materials that we'll go ahead and send out to you. So, no need to be, screenshotting or anything like that. We'll make sure that you get all the information out lickety split so that you can go ahead and move forward with it. So tonight we have a pretty brief agenda. We have a little bit of time tonight, but we're really hoping to make the best use of it. So we're first going to take a little bit of time and talk about kind of what conflict looks like, how we define that. We're going to talk about barriers to good relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about effective communication. If we have some time, we're going to go over some common scenarios. And then at the end, hopefully give you a few more resources that if you need them, they're available for you to make this process a little bit smoother for you. So we're going to jump right in. So the first thing we want to talk about, this may seem sort of funny, but how do we know there's conflict? So what does conflict look like? What does conflict sound like? What does it feel like? And if you want to just take yourself off mute and shout some things out, you should feel free to do so. If you want to put it in the chat, you can also do that. Julie will keep track of that for us. So how do you know there's conflict? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like?
Heavy.
Heavy. Excellent. Right.
That's a
It
good one.
feels heavy. That's great. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, I thrive on conflict. I think that's sort of an interesting thing to say, because really no one thrives on conflict. But here's the interesting thing about conflict. Conflict is the only way that change happens, right? So sometimes conflict sounds like a lot of yelling, and sometimes it sounds like the silent treatment, right? Sometimes conflict feels very fast paced, and sometimes conflict feels very slow, right? Sometimes you can tell from someone's body language that conflict is coming in, and sometimes you really can't. Humans are pretty good at sorting out when there's conflict. Usually we just aren't really sure how to get through it. We know something feels bad. We know it doesn't feel right, but we're just not sure how to find that path through the conflict. So the way that we define conflict is it's a sign that someone's needs are not being met. And so what I mean by that is that you think about small children who really don't have sort of language and can't really articulate very well what they're looking for. They'll throw a tantrum. They'll cry, right? They will run around. They don't know how to articulate how they're feeling. Well, sometimes grownups are like that too, right? Sometimes we don't know how to articulate that our needs are not being met. And many of us are a little bit shy about telling people what our needs are because we think people aren't going to like us or something bad is going to happen. So, we do this little dance of pretending that we don't care, but we really do care. And so when someone's needs are not being met, and that could be a need for information, that could be a need for to be heard, it could be a physical need or an emotional need. But when someone's needs aren't being met, you know that there's conflict, and then you start to feel it, you start to see it, you start to think about conflict and how you're ever going to get yourself out of that, right? It's a great way. This picture is a great way for us to kind of look at conflict. So again, conflict is the path to change. It's the only way that things change for us. But there's kind of unhealthy conflict, which is me versus you. So we're at each other. You're doing something I don't like. You have something that I want. You're not listening to me. We're arguing about whatever it is. And so we are battling it out. Healthy conflict, the conflict that leads us to change, is when you and me are versus the problem, right? So we've recognized that it's not that I don't like Julia. or it's not that, Julia is, is sort of my enemy, is that Julia and I can actually work against a problem, a separate problem. So that's really what we try to look for, is this shift when we're talking about navigating through conflict, is getting from you versus me to you and me versus the problem. Once that shift starts to happen, things really start to move and we're able to change things pretty effectively. But as long as we stay in this you versus me place, we're never going to get anywhere. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. When you're in a conflict, how can you move? How can you shift from you versus me to you and me versus the problem? You can think of it really simply, right? Sometimes you might come home and your family says to you, "What do you want for dinner tonight?" And you're like, "I don't know. What do you want?" And you go back and forth for like 10 minutes because no one can decide what they want for dinner, right? And then you start to get irritated. You're like, "Well, why didn't you make something? I was working. Well, I was working too. Well, and then it just starts to go back and forth. When the reality is that the shift that you need to see is, okay, what are we going to have for dinner? It's not me versus you. It's us versus the dinner. So think about that when you're thinking about sort of that shift to conflict. So here at the center, we try and sort of support folks as they try to move through conflict, right? So there are really 3 pretty simple steps to getting through conflict. They're just hard to do, right? So the first one is you want to identify the conflict. What are the needs that aren't being met? Who's being impacted? Where is it happening, right? Step number 2 is you want to think about what you want to get out of this. What's the outcome that you're looking for, right? Do you want to are you having a conflict with someone that you want to have a future relationship with, like a family member or a neighbor or a coworker? Do you have time to invest in this, in navigating through this conflict? Is it a conflict that's just not that important to you and you don't really feel like investing any time into it? For example, what you're having for dinner, right? The third step, and the really important step, is identify your path. How are you going to navigate through the conflict? And the way that we suggest that folks do this is that you stay curious. And what I mean by that is that you ask questions. So one of the things that we do as humans is we take information in, but we kind of usually have some preconceived notions about either the other person or the situation. So when we take in information, when we observe things, we kind of put it all into our preconceived notions, right? The only way we can step out of those assumptions and out of those preconceived notions is to ask questions. Ask questions of the other person. Ask questions of the people who are around, right? And you want to think about when and where you're asking these questions, right? Because we all know there's a time and a place for everything. And so sometimes the time that you want to ask the question is not the time that the other person is prepared to listen to the question, right? You might want to think about the time, right? Is it the end of the day? Is it the beginning of the day? When is the best time to have a conversation that is going to be a little bit uncomfortable? And also, how are you going to have this conversation? Is this a text? Is this an email? Is this a phone call? Is this in person? Is it over a cup of coffee? All of these things are really important variables to think about because they can either help or hinder finding the path through conflict, right? So one of the conflicts that we want to talk a little bit about tonight is sort of neighbor relationships, right? And you'll hear us use the word relationships a lot because relationships are things that humans have. We have relationships with each other. And sometimes those are familial relationships. They are friend relationships. They are work relationships, but they're all relationships because we're all humans. And so navigating through human relationships is really difficult. For us tonight, we're going to focus a little bit about relationships that might come up as part of work. So, for example, relationships with neighbors. And thinking about what those relationships look like and maybe what are some barriers to having really good relationships. Because one of the things we know is that when we have conflict, which is a sign that someone's needs are not being met, right? Our relationship suffers. We don't have as good a relationship when there's conflict as we do when we navigate through it. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about what gets in the way of good relationship with neighbors. So Julia?
Yeah, so to kind of turn this lens a little bit more into the aquaculture world of things, as Tricia mentioned, we're going to focus on this relationship that an aquaculture farmer leaseholder might have with their neighbors, whether it's neighbors on the water or neighbors that are on the adjacent land, maybe near the farm or overlooking the farm lease area. So again, and I know it's the end of the day on a Monday, but we're going to try to keep you guys a little bit engaged here. I'm curious, again, you can either drop a few words in the chat or come off mute. Just what are some ideas that you guys have? What would get in the way of having a good relationship with neighbors? And it could even be tied if you're not an aquaculture farmer, you can always, in your own neighbor relations as well. So what might be some things that would get in the way of having a good relationship? Yeah, not communicating. Different livelihoods. Criticism, defensiveness. Yeah, these are great. Judgments, boundaries. Yeah, neighbor relations, I feel like are one of the trickiest relationships that we can have sometimes. Land use, criticism. Yeah, preconceived notions of aquaculture. That's one that we're going to touch on that a little bit later. So thank you, Annie, for bringing that up. That's great. Awesome. So if you guys have more stuff, feel free to keep dropping it in the chat. But yeah, so those, right there, we can all think of at least 5 things off the top of our heads where we've probably had an experience with a neighbor. Or maybe currently having kind of some conflict with a neighbor in some capacity. So as we go through, we'll talk about some different ways. So on the next slide, Tricia, we've got, again, some similar, some of these things that came up, you guys mentioned, but lack of communication, making assumptions, misinformation, maybe giving a notice about something, not giving a notice about, whether it's, house construction work or notice about you starting to get active on a farm lease, and the unknowns. Sometimes, yeah, people just make assumptions and they try to fill in missing information they might not know, or just kind of word of mouth through the grapevine. Great. So to overcome some of these barriers of effective communication, there's some different phrases that we can start to think towards. Tricia, do you want to cover this piece?
Yeah, sure. So
Great.
The quote that you have up on the screen is just kind of one that helps us to remember that it's really hard to communicate, right? I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. So this is the classic telephone game that some of you may have played when you were kids. You start off with one word, and as it goes through multiple people, it just gets jumbled up, right? So it's really important for us to think about how other people are responding to our communication. So let's take a look. So there are 3 really important ways to communicate when we're trying to make sure that we're either avoiding conflict on the front end or navigating through it. So these 3 tips are just super, super easy and super helpful. So number 1, you want to communicate as early as possible. Number 2, you want to communicate as completely as possible. And number 3, you want to say this, not that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So the first one to this is communicating as early as possible. So you want to talk about your plans to everyone, right? You want to think about whether or not you want someone to hear something from someone other than yourself, right? And the answer to that is you really don't. So if you have something that's going on, if I have a neighbor who lives in back of me and we share a fence, right? And a couple of years ago, that fence kept kind of falling down. One time it falls on their side of their property. The other time it falls on mine. And so we both independently decided that we were going to get a new fence. So my family did some research. We, priced it out. We had got a quote. We hired someone and they were going to start on a Thursday. On Tuesday night, my neighbor saunters over and says, "Hey, great news. I hired someone to replace our fence." I mean, yes, great news, but no, not great news, because I also hired someone to replace our fence, right? So the bottom line is, if either one of us had taken the time to go and talk to the other person ahead of time and to let them know what was going on, we probably could have figured this out so that one of us didn't have to lose any money by having put a down payment on something, when we really could have just talked and said, hey, let's work together and try and fix this fence, right? These conversations are hard sometimes, right? I think our natural inclination as humans is to avoid conversations that might seem uncomfortable, or you think maybe the other person's not going to respond well to that. But here's the bottom line. It only gets worse if you wait, right? Just keep that in mind. Nothing gets better by waiting. And a lot of people get really frustrated when they hear something, a rumor or, a suggestion from someone who's not you. Right. So, for example, if I had heard from our other neighbor that this one neighbor is putting in a fence, I would have been kind of miffed. Why don't you just come and talk to me? Right. Even if it's hard, even if it's uncomfortable, talking about this and sharing that information as early as possible is always the best choice. And look, if you have challenges with that, if that's something you just don't feel comfortable about, the Center for Mediation can absolutely help to facilitate those conversations. We've done that a number of times with both sort of formal conversations and informal conversations, because sometimes it's just really hard to do. So, if you feel like you need support with that, we're happy to help. So the second piece is you want to share information as completely as possible, right? So again, if you have information and you're communicating that out in a timely manner, you want to get as much information on the table as you possibly can. No one likes the sort of dribs and drabs, nickel and dime kind of thing, which is when you tell them one thing and then they think it's, okay, that's it. And then the next day you're like, oh, and another thing. And then a couple of days go by and, oh, and another thing, right? That just doesn't feel great. It feels like maybe you're withholding information. It feels like you don't want to share it with them. Again, one of the things that you should be thinking about when you are engaging in these conversations or these communications, because it might be, again, it might not be a conversation, a verbal conversation. It might be an email or a text message. Think about how you would feel, right? Think about how you would feel if you got just half the story, or a quarter of the story, or you got part of the story today and part of the story tomorrow, right? Kind of classically put yourself in the other person's shoes and see what that feels like, and see if that's really maybe the best way. I would caution you on this. In the grand scheme of things, there are much easier ways to communicate than verbally, right? Text is great. Email is great. A letter in the mail is great. People respond most positively to verbal communication. It's the hardest kind of communication, but it allows you to really build that relationship that you're looking for. So I know, I'd much rather write an email. I don't want to call Julia. What if I'm bothering her? What if she's doing something? What if she doesn't know my phone number? So I'd rather just, send a quick email and I'll let her know what's going on. The challenge is when I send an email, Julia's going to read that email and it might not be read in the way that I intended. All right. Same thing with a text message. There's a lot of opportunities for misunderstandings in those kinds of communication. So if you have the opportunity to talk with folks, it really does make a huge difference. So we talked about this a little bit just a minute ago, but look, there's a bunch of different ways that you can communicate with folks. You can communicate in person, by phone, by email, by text. You can also communicate by your body language. You don't have to say one word, and you can let people know you're happy, you're sad, you're angry, you're curious, right? Your body language speaks volumes. And so keep in mind that the body language of other people is also really helpful to you, because it can sometimes give you a clue as to how they're feeling, right? So it sometimes can let you know, oh, Julia said she was okay with this, but it doesn't look like she's okay with this, right? If you think about your sort of personal world, your family, your close friends, you're probably pretty good at reading their body language, right? Because you spend a lot of time with them and you're invested in that relationship. If you spend a little bit of time thinking about body language with other people, you'll be surprised at how much better both you're able to communicate and your communication is received, okay? So the last piece that we talked about in communication was say this, not that. Right? Now, there are some phrases that you can use that absolutely build cooperation, right? You can say things like, wow, no wonder you're feeling frustrated. Oh, please tell me what happened. Let me write this down so I know exactly how you're feeling, so I've got it right. sure that we can find a solution. Let me see if I understand you clearly. Thank you so much. I hear what you're saying, right? These are all phrases that you can use as part of your communication that let the other person know that you're listening, that you're hearing, that you have some empathy, and that you're going to work together to find a solution, right? What people get frustrated by sometimes is when you bring a problem to their door and you just drop it off, right? And there's no cooperation, there's no collaboration, right? So these phrases can often be very, very helpful in conversation because they let the other person know that you've heard them, you value what they're saying, and you're willing to work on a solution, right? Now, of course, the other side of the coin is that there are some phrases that escalate conflict, okay? These are phrases that none of us like to hear, right? I already told you that. It's not my fault. You're not listening to me. That's not my job. There's nothing I can do about that. I don't make the rules. And my all-time favorite, you need to calm down, right? So I don't know about you, but anytime in my life that anyone's ever told me that I need to calm down, it has the exact opposite effect on me. You tell me to calm down, I start to get less calm, actually, right? Because again, people don't like to be told what to do. So these are phrases that just serve, unfortunately, that they serve to escalate conflict. Now, look, we've all used these phrases before. It's okay if one of them pops out in the heat of the moment. You just want to backtrack a little bit, go back to one of these other phrases and say, you know what? Sorry, I said that. I'm feeling really frustrated, right? I'm really struggling with this conversation right here, right now. Maybe I need a break. Maybe I need a minute to gather my thoughts together. It's not a deal breaker if you accidentally say, you're not listening to me, or, there's nothing I can do about that, which might be true. Right? It may be true that the other person's not listening. It may be true that it's not your fault. It may be true that you don't make the rules. That doesn't mean that it's going to be received well from the other person. Again, that's a perfect opportunity to say, look, how can we work together to solve this conflict? How can we together kind of find that path, right? So you're talking to folks, oops, sorry about that. You want to try to focus on phrases that build cooperation and try and stay away from phrases that maybe tend to escalate conflict. Okay. All right. So Julia, let's talk about
Awesome.
other ways that folks can communicate effectively and maybe
Yeah.
some checklists and things that we have that can help them.
Great. Yeah. And actually, before moving on to this slide, Tricia, I just wanted to give a pause here because I know it's a lot of information. So I actually wanted to give a pause here for a chance for anybody to ask questions. I know it hasn't been super specific to aquaculture quite yet, but yeah, I just want to give a pause here. If people have any questions they want to drop in the chat or come off mute, and feel free to ask those before we move on to some more specific examples. So this would be a good time.
So I'm just curious how we can hope to have a verbal confirmation and still reach as wide a group as possible. Those seem like that's quite challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julie,
Hi,
I can
Bob.
take this one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great question, Bob, actually. So one of the things that we've been able to do is to hold what I'll call loosely a community listening session, right? So for example, we recently had an oyster farmer who had application was up at CRMC, had received some feedback that some of the neighbors were not that excited. I know this would be an unusual situation, but so what we did is we actually held a group listening session with all of the neighbors. And again, the Center for Mediation can facilitate that. We, found a location, found, a place to have it. We're able to get, many of the sort of stakeholders in the same place at the same time. And we're able to facilitate that conversation. Now, look, can you have that conversation with 100 people? Well, not as effectively as you can with 10 or 15 or 20, but it can be done. And I think, again, there are times when just because of logistics, you may have to utilize other communication methods other than face-to-face conversation. We absolutely recognize that. But we also know that, the most effective, I should say, it's not the best, the most effective communication vehicle when you're trying to either ease conflict or navigate through it or even prevent it is a face-to-face or in the same place, same time conversation, because it really allows people to process through information. Very often people in a group setting, you may think that, wow, that's just going to be crowd mentality and they're all going to kind of gang up and it's going to be really bad. But the reality is that also can happen to the positive. People hear things that they haven't heard before. They're listening in a way that they haven't listened before. And they're like, oh, wow, I didn't think of it that way. Yeah, that does make sense. And then it kind of works in your favor. So, I guess the answer to your question is it's very hard, but we are happy to help try to facilitate that. But there is like a cap on that. Like I would say, if you're looking at trying to have a conversation with more than probably 30 people, we would typically do that in multiple sessions. We wouldn't try to do that kind of all at once because it would be difficult. And we want it to be a good use of people's time and not add to the frustration or add to the conflict.
Are there any other questions? That was a really good one, Bob. Thanks for asking that. And Azure, am I missing any questions in the chat right now that I might not see?
I think you're right. You're just fine.
We're good. Okay,
Yep.
great. Awesome. Yeah, feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat as they come up. And we will have a chance to kind of get into that a little bit more. Obviously, in a short 1 hour time frame, it goes by pretty quick. So that's why we have to keep it a little bit more specific. I know there's a lot of different scenarios and situations that can come up in this field specifically, especially with the growth and being in such a small, densely populated state. Chances are mostly anyone and everyone's had this kind of a conflict happen. So what we have on the screen here is just, it's a pretty, a short but effective communication checklist. So we'll share this with our follow-up materials. It's just something to keep in mind for you if you are running into a conflict with a neighbor, being prepared, maybe having some of your, the lease area map, maybe even just having that like an aerial image with the boundaries of your planned lease, or any other details specific to where you might be launching from, storing gear, etc. So pictures are always super helpful. I'm a visual learner. Most people will pick up on stuff that's tangible. So images, pictures, graphs, things like that. You can always practice if you're someone who knows that you tend to get really fired up in confrontational situations, maybe just practicing some of those, say this phrases. It might not feel very comfortable or natural, but trying to avoid the usual go-to abrasive language. If you're aware that you have those tendencies, trying to combat that with like taking a practice of just, okay, maybe I can flip my confrontation into questioning instead, and trying to hear the person out first, which can slow the pace down if you do get into conflict. So another one is being open and approachable. So, again, maybe it's the neighbor is intimidated by you. Like maybe they don't really understand, the lifestyle and just anything that's really surrounding being out on the water and farming. So they might not feel comfortable coming up, maybe if you don't wave or smile at them, it could be something like that on their end. Another thing related to this is listening to the concerns. So if you do get into a conversation with the person and they are expressing, what the concerns are, trying to take that step back to listen, because we all know if you're really, if you've been doing something for a really long time, you forget to take off that lens of an outsider's perspective who might not understand the nuances and ins and outs of, really any situation. So maybe trying to take that step back to listen to the concerns they're having first. It might be a really silly, simple concern to you, but for them, it's really unknown and might feel really upsetting. But if you have that opportunity to listen first, so you can better educate and answer them. So tying into that, this conflict can be also a really good opportunity for education, especially about aquaculture. it could be a really good chance to share with them all the really positive, good stuff that is going on in the water, really. So, maybe even explaining too what type of gear you have on the farm. Is it going to be floating? Is it going to be on the bottom? Again, maybe just talking about why you're choosing that type of gear because of, the growing system or whatever body of water you're in. And people might find learning new information could actually be, it could actually be something you can connect with them over once they understand it. Again, I feel like a big one that we all know in this industry is what's going to be visible. They think that it's going to just totally destroy any kind of view they might have. And, maybe in reality, it's like a couple little buoys, who knows, again, it really depends. It varies, obviously, lease to lease. So just explaining what's going to be visible. And then maybe that changes during different times of the year, maybe during the busy growing season, there's more stuff that's visible. Maybe in the winter, it scales back and it's a lot less stuff. Even something as simple as operating times, a lot of times I know it can be dependent on when the tides are of the day. So it might not be a clear answer, like we're on the water every day, 8 to 5. Probably not the answer. Maybe it is, depending on where you are. But again, maybe people, the neighbors might want to know, well, are there going to be people out in front of my house, all day long, all night, they just that simple, probably somewhere morning, afternoon. Again, explaining how that changes with the season. If there's a lot of scaling back in the winter, you're not going to be out there as much likely. With kelp farming, I know that growing season is a little bit different. So again, taking any kind of opportunity to educate the people just on what they could expect. And it might seem like those really simple details to you, but to them, it can really change how they're viewing this and kind of taking all this information in. And then a fun one, if it's possible, if you're comfortable with it, if it's accessible, offering a farm tour, maybe just getting that person out there or even down to where the gear is. You can just show them like, hey, here's the stuff, come meet the crew. Maybe it's a quick ride out. So yeah, those are just some things. And then as Tricia mentioned, we do have between Land and Sea Together and the Center for Mediation. We do have our agricultural mediation program as well, but we have these mediation services available to these folks that, we can help step in as a neutral third party to help facilitate if tensions are getting really high, if there's a lot of things going on, we could help pull in. If it's like a bunch of neighbors, we can help facilitate those conversations with a lot of people. And yeah, I see in the chat here, Azure, it is a two-way conversation. So growers and neighbors, both can take the initiative to reach out. Absolutely. I agree. It's, and sometimes vice versa. Sometimes it's the neighbors that might not be approachable to you. Maybe you really want to reach out and, kind of start that bridge of communication and maybe they really want nothing to do with it. So it is definitely a two-way street. But if you have the tools to kind of have this effective communication, we can't really control the other people, but we can definitely do our best to do that. So yeah. Tricia, is there anything
Julia,
related to this?
Such a good point. One of the things I'm reminded as you're going through this is that, typically we have more information, right? Like you as the farmer have the most information about what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. But again, we're painting a very rosy picture, as soon as the neighbors find out all about your farm, they're going to be super excited. And we know that doesn't always happen. So, what you can control is yourself. That's the only thing you can control. You can control what information you share, how you share it, when you share it. You can control, how you're engaging and interacting. All of those things are completely under your control. None of us can control how other people are going to respond. We can set the stage. We can use every strategy we know for success. And look, we've all encountered folks who are just not interested in learning or having this conversation, etc. And I think I would just remind you that if you come across one of those people, you just want to sort of keep your distance a little bit, to be honest with you. If someone is really that set in their feelings or in their, in their conflict, you're not going to change their mind. Right. You can make sure that they have information, make sure that you're sort of doing what you need to do, but you can't necessarily control them. And that's why sometimes bringing in sort of a neutral third party like the Center for Mediation can be very helpful, because we can often say things that you just can't. And we can help facilitate those conversations. And this is all, we'll talk about this in a few minutes. This is all free to our aquaculture farmers here in Rhode Island. So if you're wondering like, oh, that sounds great, but like, who's going to pay for that? Well, great news, you're all set. So we'll talk about that at the end with resources. But, I really appreciate what Julia said about you can only control your half of this conversation. And, if other folks are not following these strategies, that's unfortunate, but there's nothing that you can do about that.
Yeah. And also, tied into that is mediation, at least, when we're facilitating it through our program, it does have to be that both parties agree to try mediation. So if you want to try mediation and the neighbor doesn't, or vice versa, then unfortunately, again, we can't force people to do something we don't want to. We can only try our best to try to work through that conflict in the best way. So just something else to keep in mind. And I guess I should have probably started this with my intro that I am not a aquaculture grower myself. I did spend some time working on a farm here in Rhode Island, and I have a lot of friends who are farmers, and I really respect the industry. So, we aren't actively growers, Tricia and I here, but we've got a really great network, people like Azure, Bob, all of that good stuff. So that's kind of where we're coming at it with that lens. We're doing our best to try to kind of put on that lens of being in this space. And that's why I think next we do have some time. I want to first open it up, and I see some stuff coming in the chat. But I think I want to open it up here to see if people have any instances of a time that they might have had conflict in this space. Trying to keep this piece of it, again, maybe not using names or keeping it a little bit kind of discreet here, but talking about maybe a time that you've had conflict with a neighbor, or a situation where either it went successfully, or you had a really, really hard time and maybe things are still ongoing and not resolved. So I do want to open up some space. We do have a decent amount of time. And if not, we can also kind of work through a role play just to give some examples. But I really think hearing from some of the folks on the call might be a good way for everyone to maybe hear some other things. All right. So I see, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a couple things in the chat. You want me to try and answer those?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So Cal, great question. When do you think is the right time to bring in mediation, boundary agents, spanners, or is it case by case every time? So there's two. I'll sort of give you a double answer. There's two times I think to take advantage of mediation services. So one is as what I'll call a little bit of a proactive approach, right? So this is when, sort of at the beginning, typically there's a group of people who maybe, as Julie said, just don't have all the information, aren't sure what's going on. And you want to have really, it's less of a mediation and more of kind of a facilitated conversation. It's a little bit of an education session. And we do these, I don't want to say all the time, but on a fairly regular basis, where we bring together the farmer, other interested parties, and that could be CRMC, it could be neighbors, could be lots of different folks. And we really have what we try to have, we try to set the stage is just a really open, positive conversation, right? So that really is intended to give everyone information, maybe get some misinformation cleared up, and kind of get everyone grounded on the same page. The other time to actually have mediation is when there is, I'm going to call it an established conflict. So maybe all of the neighbors are on board and you have one neighbor who is 100% not on board. There is actually a formal mediation process that can happen where these parties sit down and they might be represented by counsel or they might not. So there might be lawyers, they might not. And we provide 1 or 2 professional mediators, and we go through the mediation process. And that's a little bit more formal. It's much less casual. It typically is with 1 or 2 people. That's not a group session. But that's really for when maybe we've had the group session and there's still some really challenging things going on, and we want to really get to the heart of the conflict between these 2 entities. Someone else asked, what if they're lawyers? They're lawyers all the time, right? And we recognize that very often in our society. We say, oh, there's a conflict, I've got to hire a lawyer. So mediation can happen regardless of whether or not there are lawyers involved. So you can, you as the farmer may have a lawyer representing you. That doesn't mean you can't participate. And if the other party or parties has a lawyer representing them, that doesn't preclude them from participating in mediation either. Everything's more difficult with lawyers. I think that's fair, but absolutely does not stop the process in any way.
We've got a hand raised too. So, David, if you wanted to come off mute.
Yep, I am off mute. Dave Bankson, retired URI professor of fisheries and aquaculture. I just wanted to make people aware that about 15 years ago, give or take a couple of years, we had not at an individual conflict between one grower and somebody else, but at the state level, a form of conflict resolution that was coordinated by the CRMC aquaculture coordinator at that time. And it was an effort to bring together the growers, the commercial fishers, environmental groups, other sorts of people. And it was, I thought, extremely effective. Bob Rowe was there. And by the way, I want to acknowledge Bob, particularly for 30 years of scars incurred in this business. But the thing was, we all got together to discuss. Notes were not kept. We could all say whatever we wanted to. And then at the end, there was a kind of a final product of revising Rhode Island's aquaculture regulations. The thing that was really important was that the people representing these groups could be in the room together and be positive about trying to reach a resolution. And the contrast I want to make is with a public hearing where people get up and they know that they've got all their supporters behind them and they have to pound the podium and yell and scream. And that, by and large, did not happen with this process. And so it's something that people may want to go back and look at if they need to.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Dave, is there a place we can, I know you said the details weren't recorded and that was part of what made it maybe effective, but is there a way folks can look at that or reference it or any sort of summary, or is there something we can point to learn from that process better? I
think there was a final report, I think from kind of written by a bunch of us from CRMC, but maybe the best open source would be an article that Carrie Byron and some of the others of us published in 2011 in Azure. I can send that to you if you don't have it.
Got it. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just just sort of follow up with that, I think you're spot on. I think that, folks behave very differently when they are in public and when they are in private. And I think when you have things like open hearings and there's lots of people around and some people feel the need to grandstand or some people are very uncomfortable. It goes on both sides. Very often you don't get things accomplished. And one of the benefits of the mediation process is just that confidentiality. So when there's a mediation or a guided conversation, everything that happens in that room is confidential. In fact, there's a state law in Rhode Island that says the mediators cannot share information that happens during a mediation session. So, very often that does give people a little bit of comfort that you're all kind of working on the same thing. And what was just described is exactly that shift from all of us fighting with one another to all of us solving a problem together. Right. And I know, again, we're painting a very rosy picture, and, Bob put in the chat, he's absolutely right. When neighbors get together and kind of decide that they're not going to be in favor of something, it's not just you having an individual conversation with one neighbor. It seems like it's this whole group of people who suddenly, yesterday you were friends and today they're all against something. Right. And so very often having those facilitated conversations as early as possible, again, helps people to understand the actual information, because we find very often people, I think someone said this very, very early on, Julie, if I'm not mistaken, people just don't understand what aquaculture looks like in Rhode Island and outside their window. They think there's going to be a floating barge with people standing up on it all hours of the day and night and big spotlights. And, that's not necessarily the case. And so very often these facilitated conversations, these group sessions, are an opportunity to educate and to really get all of the information out so that everyone can participate more fully in the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm seeing Azure's comment too about having the Center for Mediation attend some of those public hearing meetings.
And Mei Lin had a comment too, you might see in the chat about sort of notification to neighbors. And I know also post last year during the Narragansett Base Camp aquaculture element process that the state engaged in, and many on the call were a part of as well, aquaculture industry members, community members, etc. There is that is something that new growers are required to do, is to reach out to abutters and neighbors in a way that's effective to communicate what they're planning to do. And so that's, I think, was a really great change. Extra effort certainly on the part of the new grower, but I think that might be able to address some concerns early before a conflict arises. So that's a great point, Mei Lin.
Yeah, and to Bob's point too, I think a lot of meetings over Zoom and more communication happening over text and email and Zoom is definitely really, really hard to continue any kind of collaboration and communication effort a lot. We definitely see that a lot here. It just the personality can't come through quite as much, and you can't really explain things quite as well in a text or an email that you could maybe in person, and having the time to do that. So I'm seeing this other one too, methodologies for changing the opinions of those who believe aquaculture is not a good thing. Yeah, I think that goes back, Joseph, I think that goes back to the point of we can't control everyone. We can only do our best. So really trying to do our best to educate and communicate. And, maybe if you do have some, facts about how we know oysters and kelp, I mean, you're not feeding them anything, they're cleaning the water. It's really such a beneficial thing for the ecosystem. So if you could try to, hear out their concerns, even it can be really frustrating because sometimes their concerns are very misinformed. So if you could do your best in those situations to try to educate them, and, I hear you, but actually I want to share, there's this really cool study that actually shows, the farm can actually create more fishing spots. It's not gonna, maybe it's not taking away as much. It can create better ecosystems, more fish coming to the area, etc. Those are the really hard conversations. And to be honest, sometimes people really just don't want to hear it, right? We know some people can just be so set in their ways that we can only do our best. And there might come a time where you just have to decide, okay, is it worth staying in this conflict? Can we get on the same side and work through things together? Or is this person just so set on being, totally fighting tooth and nail everything you say. And you just have to draw that clear boundary for yourself as well, to know how to kind of respectfully just, okay, I hear you, and sort of walk away. Tricia might have something else to chip in on that, but I also, there's
sure.
also,
I mean, Julie really hit the nail on the head. I mean, Joseph, if only we knew how to change minds, right? We'd be in great shape. And I think the challenge, or the responsibility of the farmer is to do what they can to educate as early as possible, as completely as possible, using the best language. And then you have to sort of assume that other people are going to respond the way they're going to respond. So you may not, the short answer is you may not be able to change their opinion. What you can do is be confident in what you're doing, be confident that you have followed all of the rules, we're trying to, you have to notify neighbors within 1,000 feet, right? So that makes sense. So if someone is, 1,010, you might want to reach out to them anyway, right? Like you might want to just go the extra mile. The other thing that I would suggest is, and I know I've said this 1,000 times, but as early as possible, because here's the benefit of early communication. First of all, you are a little bit more amenable to collaborating and compromising early on in the process, right? The last thing anyone wants to do is to get all the way through, be ready at the end, waiting for it, and then suddenly someone's got, 10 things to say. You're not in any frame of mind to compromise at that point, right? You've invested your time, your energy, your dollars. So if you can have some of those difficult conversations earlier on, the stakes are lower, right? The closer you get to the finish line, the higher the stakes are for everyone. You see it all the time. Well, I see it all the time now that the CRMC, hearings are on Zoom. I can watch whenever I want in case I can't fall asleep or something. But you watch that and stakes are high, right? People are at the end. So neighbors are more up in arms. Farmers are a little bit more sort of set in their ways because look, you've been through this. It takes years to get these things through. That's incredibly frustrating all around. If you can have some of these conversations early on, that's just your best chance for success. So, don't look to necessarily change opinions, but look to find a path through, right? What you want to do is you want to find the way to get the farm in place, right? That's the goal. And so how you do that is kind of on a case by case basis. But, if someone really doesn't believe in aquaculture, which seems, I can't even believe those words are coming out of my mouth, but someone's really in opposition, you're not going to change their mind. The best thing that you can do is be confident in what you've presented, make sure you've checked all your things off the checklist. And then look, not everyone is going to be a fan, and that's okay. But as long as you've done the things that you need to do, you can move forward. Yeah, thank you, Azure. I just saw you put in the chat the listserv so that folks can stay informed. That you're absolutely right. And I think, and look, anyone can be on that listserv, right? And I've heard people say that to neighbors, look, you should just be paying attention. And look, they should, but sometimes they don't. So unfortunately, this is one of those cases where there is a little bit more responsibility on the farmer side. Like, I get that. But again, at the end of the day, hopefully that's going to be beneficial to the farmers. Hopefully by putting in this time, energy, and effort on the front end, you're going to get through this in a more timely and hopefully, a less conflicted path than you would otherwise. Because again, when you wait until the very end, that everyone's stakes are high, everyone's frustrations are high. No one likes anything to change at the last minute, neighbors or farmers. And so if you can just do a little work on the front end, you're in a much better spot. And again, you don't have to do this by yourself, right? So the Center for Mediation, through some funding from USDA, is able to offer free mediation services and free services to pull together these group conversations. If you need us, just give us a call. We're happy to do that. We've done it a number of times over the past couple of years, fairly successfully. And we're happy to continue to do that because we recognize, first of all, the benefit of aquaculture in the state of Rhode Island. Right. I think it should go without saying, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that. And two, we really believe that there's a path through this conflict. And we know how hard it is. It's hard for neighbors. It's hard for farmers. So we're happy to sort of step in the middle and try and help you guys get through this.
And to also add on to that, and going back to the question earlier about lawyers being involved, I think, sometimes that is totally necessary. But as Tricia mentioned, mediation might be something you want to try before getting lawyers involved. Lawyers can be really expensive. It can really drag the process out. So, maybe now having these tools of kind of taking a step back and thinking through what other methods there are to get through conflict. Maybe it's something, if you're in a situation, or if it happens to come up, maybe you throw out trying mediation before jumping right to, well, I'm going to get a lawyer. No, I'm going to get a lawyer. Like, too late, I already have a lawyer. And because again, that's sort of that escalation piece in that conflict. And it's going to just drag it out. Nobody ever really wants to go through that process. It takes a lot of time, energy, money. Mediation may or may not work. That's the other thing. It sometimes can be super successful. Sometimes maybe it's just the parties aren't going to budge and it's not going to be enough, but it's almost like it's worth trying it. You really have nothing to lose by doing the mediation if it does get to that level. But I think having all of these other tools to try to work through, again, on your end, you're sort of being the more maybe informed party by having this checklist, but you can only really do your best to navigate that conflict and hope that it works out.
Thank you both. This was so informative, and it was really just a good reminder for our lives in general, outside of the aquaculture context. I really, really appreciate you both and all the work you do. And we will again share these great slides and resources. Julia and Tricia, if there's things that popped up, other resources you'd want to add in light of the conversation, please feel free. We'll give it a day before we post. And to all of you, again, happy Veterans Day. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Be safe and go out in good communication.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Asher. Yeah, I just dropped some links in the chat, but we'll send those up in the follow-up.
Thank you all. Appreciate you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Azure, don't forget to send me that link.
Okay. Thanks, Kit.